Sera woke up before the sun every morning. She did not need an alarm. Her body had learned long ago that rest was a luxury she could not afford. She pulled herself off the thin mat in the corner of the servants' room, folded her blanket neatly, and began her day in silence, the same way she did everything else. She had not spoken a word since she was 7 years old. A fever had taken her voice and never given it back. The healers had tried. Her mother had prayed. Nothing worked. Eventually, everyone stopped trying, and Sera learned to live in the quiet space between words. She learned to communicate with her eyes, with small gestures, with the way she tilted her head or pressed her lips together. Those who paid attention could understand her perfectly. Most people, however, did not pay attention. The palace of Ironveil was enormous. Its stone walls rose so high they seemed to touch the clouds, and its corridors stretched so long that new servants sometimes got lost for hours. Sera had lived there since she was 12, brought in as a kitchen helper after her mother passed. She was now 23. She knew every hallway, every staircase, every door that stuck in the rain. She had scrubbed those floors, carried those trays, polished those windows. The palace was, in the only honest sense of the word, her home, even if no one there thought of her that way. Alpha King Caelum Draveth ruled Ironveil with the kind of authority that made grown men lower their eyes. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried himself the way mountains carry themselves, as if the earth beneath them was simply doing its job. He had won 3 border wars before he was 30. His wolf was the largest anyone in the territory had ever seen. When he walked into a room, conversation stopped. When he gave an order, it was followed without question. He was not a cruel man by nature, but he was a proud one. And pride, left unchecked, has a way of becoming its own kind of cruelty. Sera had crossed his path only a handful of times over the years. He had never once acknowledged her. To him, she was part of the palace the way the furniture was part of the palace. Present, functional, and completely unremarkable. The full moon feast changed everything. It was the most important night of the Ironveil calendar. Every alpha from every neighboring pack territory came to the palace. Long tables were set with the finest food, the finest wine, the finest everything. The hall was lit with hundreds of candles, and the entire court dressed in their best. It was the one night of the year when the kingdom presented itself to the world, and King Caelum sat at the head of it all, like a man who had never once doubted that he deserved to be there. Sera was assigned to serve the head table that night. It was not a role she had been given before, and her stomach tightened when she heard it. The head table meant the king, his generals, and the visiting pack leaders. It meant more eyes, more pressure, less room for mistakes. She carried herself carefully all evening. She refilled glasses without being asked. She moved quietly between the chairs. She kept her face calm, even when one of the generals made a remark about her silence to the man beside him, and both of them laughed. She was used to that. It was near the end of the feast when it happened. One of the visiting alphas pushed his chair back suddenly, without warning, and it caught Sera's leg as she was passing behind him with a full jug of dark wine. She stumbled. Her hands gripped the jug, but the momentum was already moving, and the wine tilted forward in a dark arc and landed directly on the front of King Caelum's ceremonial robe, the white and silver one worn only on this night, the one that had belonged to his father and his grandfather before him. The hall went quiet. Sera stood absolutely still. Her heart was beating so fast she could feel it in her throat. She looked at the wine spreading across the white fabric, and then she looked up at the king. She did not run. She did not make a dramatic gesture of apology. She simply held his gaze and pressed one hand to her chest, the way she always communicated that she was sorry. Caelum stood up slowly. He looked at his robe. He looked at her. And then he looked around the room at the hundreds of watching eyes, all waiting to see what the great Alpha King would do when an Omega servant spilled wine on him in front of his entire court. "You are banished from Ironveil," he said. His voice was low and even, which somehow made it worse than if he had shouted. "Leave tonight. Take nothing with you." Not one person in that hall said a word. Not one general leaned forward to suggest this was an overreaction. Not one elder touched the king's arm. The silence of the room was its own kind of cruelty, the kind that comes from hundreds of people deciding, at the same moment, that someone is not worth defending. Sera lowered her hand. She held his gaze for 3 more seconds, long enough that it was not submission, but short enough that it was not a challenge. Then she turned and walked out of the hall, through the corridor, past the kitchen where she had worked for 11 years, out the palace's side door, and into the cold night. She did not cry until she reached the trees. What no one in that palace knew, what even Sera herself did not fully understand, was that she had been born with a mark. It sat beneath her collarbone, shaped like a small crescent, silver-white against her skin, a moon mark, the kind that appears, once in several generations, on a child chosen by the moon goddess herself as a sign of her favor. The old texts called such people moon-touched. They were considered sacred, and the covenant was simple and ancient. Where the moon-touched are honored, divine grace remains. Where they are cast out, it withdraws. The moon goddess felt it the moment Sera crossed the border of Ironveil. She did not react with anger, the way humans might. She reacted the way powerful things react when they have been quietly, deliberately patient for a very long time. She stopped waiting, and she began to move. The morning after Sera was banished, the warriors of Ironveil woke up wrong. Their senses were dulled. Trackers who could follow a scent through rain could no longer follow a trail at all. Hunters came back from the forest empty-handed and confused. Children who had begun learning to shift found that nothing happened when they tried. The pack healers examined everyone and found no illness, no injury, no explanation. By nightfall, a low, uneasy energy had settled over the palace like fog. The second day brought something worse. The moon spring, a small, silver-lit pool at the center of the palace courtyard that had flowed clean and bright since Ironveil was founded, went still. By midday, the water had turned cloudy. By evening, it was gone. The stone basin sat dry and cracked under the open sky, and the elders who gathered around it looked at each other with expressions that they tried to keep calm and could not quite manage. Some of them remembered the old stories. One elder woman, her silver hair pinned back and her hands folded tightly in front of her, said Sera's name quietly to the woman standing beside her. The other woman nodded once, quickly, and neither of them said it again where anyone might hear. The king, meanwhile, was not someone who believed in signs. He had built his rule on strategy and strength, on things he could measure and control. When his advisors brought him the reports, he told them to find rational explanations. There were always rational explanations. He believed this the way some people believe things, not because they have proven them, but because they need them to be true. On the third morning, Caelum woke up and reached, the way he always did, for his wolf. That deep, powerful presence that had lived inside him since childhood, the part of him that was instinct and strength and certainty. And it was not there. Not gone entirely, but silent. Pulled back behind a wall he could not see or touch. He lay in his bed in the early morning dark and felt, for the first time in his adult life, entirely alone inside himself. Just a man, just a body, nothing more. He sat up, he dressed. He went to the throne room and sat in his chair and stared at the wall for a long time. That night, the moon rose red. It happened slowly, a deep, spreading crimson that moved across the full face of the moon until the entire sky above Ironveil was lit in a color that had no business being there. The palace went completely quiet. Warriors stopped in the corridors. Servants pressed against windows. Even the animals in the stables went still. Caelum was alone in the throne room when the silver light came through the windows. It was cold and clean, and unlike any light he had ever seen. Not warm, not harsh, simply absolute. The temperature dropped. His breath appeared in small clouds, and then a voice filled the room, not from any direction, but from everywhere at once, the way thunder fills the air. It was not loud. It did not need to be. The voice showed him things rather than simply told him. Not in words, in images, in feelings that moved through his chest like a hand reaching in and pressing down. He saw Sera's life in his palace, not a summary of it, but the texture of it, the years of silent work, the small cruelties he had never witnessed and never tried to witness. The night of the feast, replayed, but this time he saw it from outside himself, the way you might see a stranger behave badly in a crowd, and feel the distance between who you thought you were and what you were actually doing. He saw her walking into the forest alone, in the cold, with nothing. The voice, when it finally spoke in words, said very little. It did not lecture. It simply asked one question. What are you king of? Exactly. And then the light was gone. The throne room was dark and cold and ordinary. Caelum sat in the silence for a long time. There was no one to perform bravery for. There was no strategy to calculate. There was only the question, sitting in the air, waiting. He left Ironveil the next morning at dawn, on foot, with 2 of his most trusted guards following at a distance he asked them to keep. He did not announce it. He did not make it a royal search. He walked into the forest and began looking for a woman he had thrown away, as if she were nothing. It took 7 days. He heard about her from a farmer, 2 territories over, who said a silent woman had stayed in his barn during a rainstorm and left the next morning with the stall cleaner than it had been in years. He heard about her from a woman at a village well, who said a quiet stranger had helped her carry water when her arm was hurting, and had smiled in a way she kept thinking about afterward. He followed her trail not with wolf senses, those were still dim and unreliable, but with the patience of a man who understood, slowly and then all at once, that he was not tracking prey. He was tracing the shape of someone's life, and the shape of it was generous and careful, and completely without bitterness, despite everything. He found her on the 7th afternoon, sitting at the edge of a shallow river near the border of a small neutral territory. She was mending a piece of cloth with steady hands, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, her feet bare in the grass beside the water. She heard him coming, she looked up. She did not flinch, she did not run. She looked at him the way she had looked at him the night he banished her, directly, steadily, with those quiet eyes that had been seeing clearly all along. He stopped a few feet away. He did not stand at full height the way he normally did. He sat down on the ground, which put him lower than her for the first time in their acquaintance. I was wrong, he said. There was nothing else he had prepared, because there was nothing else honest enough to begin with. I was wrong, and I am sorry, and I do not expect that to mean very much right now. But I needed to say it to your face. Sera looked at him for a long moment. She searched his face the way she had always searched faces, not for what people wanted to show her, but for what they could not help showing. She had become very good at this, after years of listening to people with her eyes instead of her ears. What she saw was a man who had been uncomfortable with himself for the first time in a long life of comfort. A man who had walked 7 days not because a goddess told him to, but because he had looked at himself clearly and could not stop looking. She reached out and placed her hand on the ground between them, not in his hand, just between them, a small, quiet gesture. It meant, I see you, I am still here, we can begin. When Sera walked back into Ironveil, she did not walk behind the king. She walked beside him, and anyone watching would have noticed that he adjusted his pace to match hers, not the other way around. The moonspring filled that evening. By morning, the wolves of Ironveil had their senses back. Children shifted in the courtyard, laughing. The kingdom exhaled. But Caelum did not let things simply return to how they were. In the weeks that followed, he stood before his full court and spoke clearly about what he had done and why it had been wrong, not as a performance, but as a record. He changed the kingdom's laws on how Omegas were to be treated, housed, and protected. He created a council seat for those who could not speak, with Sera's written words given the same formal weight as spoken decrees. Sera never got her voice back. The fever that had taken it when she was 7 had taken it for good. But she sat at that council table, and when she wrote something down and passed it forward, the room went quiet and listened. And that, in a way that a speaking voice never quite managed, was the loudest thing anyone in Ironveil had ever heard. The moon goddess did not return. She had never needed the last word. She had simply, quietly, shown a kingdom what it lost when it decided that silent people had nothing to say.